Chapter 23. Jimmie blasts off on his rocket ship. Later that night, a few people were still sitting around the big fire talking and laughing softly. Pieces of wood crackled and hissed. I started counting the seconds between each snap. Mother had left for her night job, and I looked to see if Jimmie had fallen off yet. There hadn't been any of the twitching or soft whining he does most nights, but that really doesn't mean much, especially since I knew he'd found work earlier. If the job had been a tough one, he'd climb under his blanket and sleep without fighting against it too hard. But not tonight. He was looking right back at me. Something wrong, sis? Can't sleep? No, Jimmie, I'm doing fine. I was just about gone. You? I'm fine. I was hoping that mouth organ man was going to play, but it looks like he's through. I said, he played Shenandoah earlier, your song. Could you sing it for me just once? Sure, sis. Jimmie sat up. He says singing is like eating and serious thinking, things that shouldn't ever be done whilst lying down. He took 3 deep breaths, held the last one, then sang, "O Shenandoah, I long to see thee." And you would have put your life on the line believing him. Way-a-hey, you rolling river. He waited, shook his head, and sang more. I closed my eyes. I imagined him getting taller and taller. "O Shenandoah, I'm bound to leave thee." Jimmie's slowness when he's singing is all part of settling into the song. It was the same thing Father did when he told us stories back home in Gary. I'm not saying anything bad about her, but Father's way is so different from the way Mother tells stories. With her, it's like we're in a race. Like she's scooped up and is flying with us, too. They all lived happily ever after. When Father would tell the same story, things were easier, slower. It didn't take much to see yourself dropping breadcrumbs right along a trail, or hear yourself scheming right along with John the Conqueror, or feel yourself riding a golden horse behind Sir Lancelot with your arms wrapped around his waist and your cheek, surprised at how cool the armor on his back was. Hearing a story from Mother is like you're looking at the story from inside that boxcar. Things are swishing by so fast that it doesn't pay to get too interested or curious about any of them. With Father, it was like you were strolling along a road, holding his hand and stopping whenever someone caught your fancy. Way-a-hey, we're bound away. Cross the wide Missouri. After a long sigh, Jimmie was through. I opened my eyes. He had shrunk back to his normal size and dropped down his shoulders and was hanging his head. He said, "Sweet dreams, sis." A gentle tap, tap, tap came from the wooden frame of the door. Jimmie jumped up. With his right hand, he swiped the gingham curtain aside. He dropped his left hand behind him, and my breath caught. He was holding another long, open, straight razor. He deepened his voice. "What do you want?" A man said, "Hello, Sonny. We wanted to have a word with your sister." "You can have a word with me first. What do you want to talk to her about?" "It's her voice. Jimmie butted in. "Why? We ain't being loud. Y'all couldn't have barely heard us." 4 or 5 people laughed, and they were kind laughs, but Jimmie's body tightened. I came up behind him and pulled the razor away. I closed it and held it against my leg. It was the harmonica man who'd knocked. He said, "No, Sonny, no complaints, far from it." He looked at me. "Evening, Missy, how are you?" There were 6 or 7 men and women. 3 of them were white. They all smiled at me. I stepped in front of Jimmie. "I'm fine, thank you. How are you?" The man pulled off his hat and said, "I'd have swore I was doing just fine up to a few minutes ago when I found out I was doing something terribly wrong." He opened his hand and showed me his harmonica. "I thought I owned Shenandoah. Thought I played it like it was me that wrote it. But tonight you took that song right away from me and made it I seen how it's supposed to be done. As of tonight, I'm signing it over to you. You are spectacular." People called out, "Amen," and "Hear, hear." A woman said, "Child, do you have any idea what kind of gift you have?" "That's right, a pure gift." But it wasn't me singing, it was my brother, my big brother. I don't think a prouder sentence has ever crossed my lips. I stepped aside so they could see Jimmie. We tell him all the time that there isn't anyone else in the world with a voice so beautiful. The harmonica man said to him, "I played all over this country, and I ain't never heard nothing like that in my life. Now, I ain't trying to boast, but I used to travel with Bessie Smith, and I don't mean to disrespect her none, but she ain't half the singer you is. Not half, not on her best day." He reached his right hand toward Jimmie. "My name's Zeke Green. Folks call me Sawbone Z. And it's a true honor to make the acquaintance of a brother musician like you, sir." "Sir, it's horrible that one tiny word can do to you. You can talk yourself into believing that you're tough, then one tiny three-letter word gets said and smashes everything apart." "Sir, I'd learned not to cry or even get angry when all sorts of calamity befell us. I'd never not I'd learned not to take it personal when people barked at Mother and Jimmie and me about walking across their property. I knew how to swallow the sadness that would wash over me when Father used to come home, and we could tell by the way he worried the brim of his hat when he asked how we were doing that there'd been no work. I thought I could not control it. I could control it. And then this man called Jimmie sir, and all my hardness melted away. It was wonderful that these people liked Jimmie singing, but horrible too because I was still at the mercy of someone else's words. And Mother had told us so many times that that's something neither me nor Jimmie can afford to let happen, that we should take everything someone says, good or bad, with a grain of salt. Jimmie shook the man's hand. "My name's Jimmie Malone, sir. Pleased to meet you. I take it you're a natural. You ain't had no training?" Jimmie looked surprised. "They can train someone to sing? Not like what you done. That can't be taught. That's from inside." "Yes, sir, it is." "You mind I ask how old you is?" "I'm 17 years old, sir." With Jimmie, lying was just like singing. They both came natural to him. "I knew you was older than you look. Ain't no kid gonna sing like that. From your singing, I see you're a full-grown man." Jimmie had hardened his heart twice as much as I had mine, but from the look that came over him, I could see that when it came to those words, he was totally lost. Jimmie said, "You used to travel around with Bessie Smith? Really? You got paid to play with her? Cash money?" "I ain't gonna say it always worked out that way, but that was the idea." "And you really think I sing good as her?" "I didn't say that. I said you's better than her. Raw, but better. With a little work, you wouldn't even be playing in the same ballpark. Son, if things was the way they used to be, you could make you some money traveling. Might have even got someone to make one of 'em victorial recordings of you singing." "Naw. I said if things was the way they used to be. Ain't a whole lot of cash out there now for nothing. But if anybody was going to rake in the little bit there, it'd be you. You got a true gift, son." One of the women said, "Young man, can you and Zeke sing a couple of songs? It's late, but tomorrow's Sunday, so won't be no work nowhere." I said, "Go on, Jimmie. Mr. Z, do you know Motherless Child? You ain't gonna be able to name no spiritual I don't know. Young man, you up to giving these folks a little happiness?" Jimmie slipped his feet into his brogans. He said, "I ain't never sung with no one playing an instrument. Don't we have to practice some first? How am I going to know when I'm supposed to come in and when I'm supposed to be quiet?" "Don't worry none about that. It's my job to know when to blow up and when to shut up." I pulled on my shoes. Me and Jimmie were smiling like a couple of Cheshire cats on Christmas Day in Gary. I said, "We've enjoyed your playing ever since you came, sir. I told Jimmie and Mother that right along with Miss Toland, our Sunday school piano player back in Lancaster, you were the best musician I've ever heard." I slapped Jimmie's head. "We told you you were great, and you just didn't believe it." As we walked toward the fire, Mr. Z put his hand on Jimmie's shoulder. When you workin' with other musicians, you got to know your part. If it all come together right, it's like that stew they make for supper. Everything blended just right. Weren't too much of any one thing. When you and me play together, I'm supposed to make sure ain't too much mouth organ and too little you. You the meat in the stew. I ain't nothing but the salt. There were about 7 people still at the fire. Some were leaned up against each other close to sleep. Mr. Z sat on a stump. "What key you singing in?" Jimmie said. "Key?" The man smiled. "Hum the first bit of Shenandoah again." Jimmie did. Mr. Z blew some notes that blended in real nice with Jimmie. He said, "It's on you, young man, motherless child." Jimmie was staring into the fire, waiting until he was good and ready. Some people started giving each other sideways looks, thinking he'd chickened out. After the song longest, when Jimmie took a deep breath. "Sometimes I feel." The goose flesh jumped through my palms as Jimmie sang, "like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child." A woman yelled, "Yes, Lord." Mr. Z brought the harmonica in, and it was a perfect match for Jimmie's whispery voice. A man said, "Testify, brother." Mr. Z's playing danced around Jimmie's words and reminded me of something. In Gary on Friday nights after dinner, a lot of the Mexican people and the black people would go to the church hall for storytelling. I was shy when I first met the people of Mexico. They didn't look like us and they didn't look like white people. They had skin like ours and hair like white people's, only lots stronger and darker. They spoke a different language, too. Father was the best American storyteller, and a woman named Senorita Morales was the best one from Mexico. Miss Morales was a small boned woman, but when she spoke, she was like Jimmie. She seemed to grow. She'd use her hands, and if she was talking about a star, she'd reach up and gently pluck it. Then she'd look in her hand, like the star was resting there. If you followed her glance, you could see it too. You could even see a shadow on the ground underneath. Some superstitious Americans stopped coming because they said Senorita Morales was hypnotizing everybody. And who knew what she'd have folks doing since she got their minds? Mother pooh-poohed them and said Senorita Morales was someone who could have words do magical things. Miss Morales told the stories in her own language and in English both, and you could still understand everything. Even if you didn't know the word, something about the way she'd unfold her hands, or the way she'd smile, or the way she looked at you when she talked, let you know what she meant. If you waited, it would come. Jimmie and Mr. Z were doing the same thing with their music. They finished the song, and Mr. Z said, Jimmie grinned. A white woman said in a dreamy voice, "My God, Danny, go get your daddy's guitar." The white man Danny was sitting with put his hands on the boy's shoulder. "Rest easy, son. Thank you, Connie. But we're gonna let that guitar be tonight. I ain't got no intentions of being the alley cat at a gathering of lions." In the middle of the third song, I jumped when a hand lighted on my shoulder. "Boo! Oh, Mother." I pulled her to sit next to me. "Do you see how they're watching Jimmie?" Mother hugged her knees. Jimmie would sing a song and Mr. Z would nod and play. I poked her. "He isn't being even a little bit shy. Singing belongs to him as much as writing does to you, Deza. Plus, talking. We can't forget how comfortable you are with that." Mother loved teasing me for my verboseness. People clapped as Jimmie walked over to us. "Can I stay away and talk to Mr. Sawbone? Tomorrow's Sunday." I answered for Mother. I know her well enough that talking to me is like talking to her. Least I thought so up to this time. "Oh, yes, stay as long as you'd like." That wasn't how Mother would have answered. Her eyes widened just the littlest bit. But she said, "Yes, Jimmie, have a good time." "Wow, sis, hasn't this been the best night ever?" I laughed. "Indeed it has. Indeed it has." Mother said, "Let's go down to the creek, Deza. The sound of the water is so soothing." She wasn't mad, but there was a sadness in her as we turned away from the dying fire. "Mother, was I wrong?" "No, Deza. It's fine that he stays. He works like a grown man, so it's only right that he starts living like one too. Much as I may want to, I can't hold him forever." I did what all good conversationalists do when they don't like the direction the talk is going. I changed the subject. "Tell me what it was like when you and Father met." That always made Mother light up. She held my arm tighter and smiled. "Oh, Deza, we had the kind of happiness that can't help but draw attention to itself. We weren't trying to show off or anything, but there wasn't a bushel basket big enough or thick enough for us to keep our happiness hidden under." I loved the times when Mother talked about Father courting her. The man had talked about who was serious and shy seemed different than the happy, jokey man I knew. I dropped my head onto her shoulder, and squeezed my arm around her waist. I knew all the answers, but I asked anyway. "Were you too excited when me and Jimmie were born?" Your father told me if I ruled the world, Peg, I'd give every brown-skinned baby a note as soon as they were born. It would read, hold tight, because the only thing guaranteed is one way or the other, you're going to have a very interesting, very busy life. I said to him, Roscoe, that could be said about any baby. He smiled and said, maybe, but not to the same extent. Mother and I laughed and teased all the way down to the trail. At the creek, I squatted down to toss a twig into the water. I watched the twig bob along. It spun twice like it was trying to decide which way it should go, then bobbled off downstream. I could hear the smile in Mother's voice. You know, one of the things I love most about my baby girl, one of the things I'm so thankful for? I looked over my shoulder at her. I love the fact that you're so much smarter than I am. Took him a while to catch on, but you're smarter than your father, too. I studied her face. How could I be smarter than the smartest two people I knew? Really, no pretending, Deza. I'll never forget the first time I realized how special you are. You never talked until you were almost 3 years old. Other than a lot of laughing and some crazy noises that your father called squinking, you hadn't said a peep. We told each other we weren't worried, though, because you were such a watcher. We could see you were understanding and taking things in, so we had strong hope that you were fine. Mother smiled. I admit I was a little worried, but your daddy said, I got the feeling this one will walk when she's good and ready. We'll talk when she's good and ready. And once she does, watch out. So, what was my first word? Why? Because I'm curious, Mother. She slapped my arm. No, silly. I wasn't asking why. Why was your first word? Your grandmother Malone was visiting from Flint, and she was moaning about the fact that we only had milk for her coffee and not cream. It went on forever. You were sitting in my lap, and she said, What's a woman got to do to get some cream for her coffee around here? I've told Roscoe again and again, this nonsense like this is why I stay in Flint. Mother laughed. You piped up as clear as day. Why don't you go to the store and buy some? We wouldn't have been more shocked if the salt shaker told us it wanted to go for a walk. That was the first thing I said? No, not that. It was why. I splashed her. I hadn't seen her acting silly for the longest. Mother! Your grandmother was not amused. She wanted to skin you alive. You always frightened her. She said she never liked the way you watched everything, like you were a spy, and that if she was raising you, she'd get that smart mouthness out of you in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. Imagine that. Instead of being amazed and thrilled that you were saying full grammatically correct sentences, she was mad because you hadn't called her ma'am. And your father was right. You talked nonstop the rest of the day. I couldn't wait for him to get home to hear. When he got off work and came to the front door, I told you not to say anything to him till he talked to you first, so we could surprise him. He picked you up and said something ridiculous like, How's Daddy's darling daughter Deza doing on this delightful dusky day? And child, he nearly dropped you like you were on fire when you said, Fine, thank you. But Gram is mad at me, Daddy. She wants cream for her coffee, not milk. He bawled like a baby, and you wiped his tears and told him, Don't cry, Daddy. She's mad at Mommy and me, not you. He'd been scared to death there was something wrong. That was when we first knew what a special child we had. Mother leaned down and splashed some of the creek water on her face. Seeing Mother like this was beautiful. Jimmie was right. This had been the best night ever.